40 years ago, Burger Girl Carolina gave free food to hungry 9-year-old Steve Harvey. When he found her decades later, his $1 million surprise changed everything and proved that childhood kindness can be worth more than gold when it's remembered by a grateful heart. It was 1966, and 9-year-old Steve Harvey stood outside Mickey's Burger Shack in Cleveland, Ohio, pressing his face against the window and watching people eat hamburgers and French fries. Steve's stomach was growling so loudly he was embarrassed, but his family had no money for restaurant food. His father was between jobs, his mother was working double shifts as a maid, and there were 7 Harvey children to feed on almost nothing. Steve had been walking by Mickey's Burger Shack every day for 2 weeks, drawn by the smell of cooking food and the warmth that seemed to radiate from the small restaurant. He would stand outside for a few minutes, imagining what it would feel like to sit at one of those red vinyl booths and eat a real hamburger instead of the watered-down soup and day-old bread that his family survived on. Working behind the counter at Mickey's was 16-year-old Carolina Rodriguez, a high school junior who had taken the part-time job to help support her single mother and 3 younger siblings. Carolina had noticed the little boy who kept appearing outside the restaurant, always looking hungry and sad, never coming inside. On this particular cold afternoon in February, Carolina watched Steve through the window, his breath fogging up the glass as he stared at a customer's burger and fries. Something about the child's obvious hunger and the way he tried to hide his longing broke Carolina's teenage heart. "Hey, sweetie," Carolina called out through the window. "Are you hungry?" Steve looked around to make sure she was talking to him, then nodded shyly. "Come on in here," Carolina said with a warm smile. Steve hesitated. "I don't have any money, miss." "That's okay, honey. Come in and get warm." Steve cautiously entered Mickey's Burger Shack, his worn-out shoes squeaking on the linoleum floor. He had never been inside a restaurant before, and everything seemed magical to him. The shiny chrome stools, the red and white checkered tablecloths, the smell of burgers on the grill. "What's your name, sweetie?" Carolina asked gently. "Steve. Steve Harvey." "Well, Steve Harvey, I'm Carolina, and I think you look like you could use a good meal." Without asking permission from her manager or worrying about the cost, Carolina prepared a hamburger, fries, and a chocolate milkshake for Steve. She watched with joy as the hungry little boy's eyes lit up at the sight of the food. "This is all for me?" Steve asked, hardly believing what he was seeing. "All for you, honey. Eat up." Steve ate that hamburger like it was the best meal he had ever tasted, which it probably was. Between bites, he told Carolina about his family, his dreams of making people laugh, and how his father was looking for work. "You know what, Steve?" Carolina said. "I think you're going to be famous someday. You've got something special about you." When Steve finished eating, he stood up to leave, not knowing how to thank Carolina for her incredible kindness. "Steve, you come back here anytime you're hungry, okay?" Carolina said. "Don't you worry about money. Sometimes people just need to help each other." Over the next 6 months, Steve became Carolina's unofficial little brother. 2 or 3 times a week, when his family's food situation was desperate, Steve would appear at Mickey's, and Carolina would secretly feed him. She never made him feel like charity. She treated him like family, asking about school, encouraging his dreams of becoming a comedian, and always making sure he had enough to eat. Carolina's manager, Mr. Peterson, eventually noticed that food costs were higher than usual, and that Carolina seemed to be giving away meals. When he confronted her, Carolina expected to be fired. "That little boy is hungry, Mr. Peterson," Carolina explained. "His family doesn't have enough food, and he's just a child. I'll pay for his meals myself if I have to." Mr. Peterson, who had seen Steve's regular visits, was moved by Carolina's compassion. "Carolina, you don't need to pay for his food. What you're doing is right. Keep feeding the boy." But Carolina's kindness went beyond just providing meals. She became a source of encouragement and hope for young Steve during one of his family's most difficult periods. "Steve, you keep working on that comedy," Carolina would tell him as he ate. "Someday you're going to make people all over the world laugh, and you're going to remember this time when things were hard. In the summer of 1966, Steve's father finally found steady work, and the Harvey family's financial situation improved enough that Steve no longer needed Carolina's help. On his last visit to Mickey's, Steve hugged Carolina and promised he would never forget her kindness. "You saved me, Carolina," 9-year-old Steve told her. "When I become famous, I'm going to find you and thank you properly." Carolina smiled and ruffled his hair. "You just take care of yourself, Steve Harvey. Make me proud." That was the last time Steve saw Carolina Rodriguez. Over the years, as Steve struggled through his early comedy career, he often thought about the teenage girl who had fed him when he was hungry. During his homeless years in the 1980s, when he was sleeping in his car and wondering if he should give up on comedy, Steve would remember Carolina's words, "Someday you're going to make people all over the world laugh." When Steve finally achieved success in the 1990s, he began what would become a decades-long search for Carolina Rodriguez. He hired private investigators, searched social media, and even visited Cleveland to look for anyone who remembered Mickey's Burger Shack or the kind teenage girl who had worked there. But finding Carolina proved to be incredibly difficult. Mickey's Burger Shack had closed in 1975. Many people from the old neighborhood had moved away or passed away. Carolina's name was common, and without more specific information, the searches kept hitting dead ends. "I need to find Carolina Rodriguez," Steve would tell his staff regularly. "She saved my life when I was a child, and I need to thank her properly." The breakthrough finally came in 2023, when Steve's research team connected with a genealogy expert who specialized in tracking down people from old neighborhoods. Using city records, high school yearbooks, and old phone directories, they were able to trace Carolina Rodriguez to San Antonio, Texas, where she was now Carolina Martinez, having married and raised a family of her own. When Steve's team contacted 73-year-old Carolina Martinez, she was initially confused and suspicious. "You're saying Steve Harvey wants to find me?" Carolina asked the investigator. "The Steve Harvey from television?" "Yes, ma'am. He says you knew him when he was a child in Cleveland." Carolina's memory came flooding back. Little Steve. Oh my goodness. Little Steve Harvey. Is that really the same boy? When the investigator confirmed that Steve Harvey, the television host, was indeed the same hungry little boy she had fed at Mickey's Burger Shack, Carolina began crying. "I always wondered what happened to that sweet little boy," she said through tears. "I hoped and prayed that his dreams came true." Carolina's current situation was heartbreakingly modest. She was a 73-year-old widow living on Social Security in a small apartment in San Antonio. Her husband had died 3 years earlier, and she was struggling to make ends meet on her fixed income. She worked part-time at a local grocery store to supplement her Social Security, and she had been worried about being able to afford her rent and medical expenses. 2 weeks later, Carolina received a phone call that would change her life forever. "Miss Martinez, this is Steve Harvey. I don't know if you remember me, but you saved my life when I was 9 years old." Carolina started crying immediately. "Steve, my little Steve, of course I remember you. You were that sweet, hungry little boy who wanted to be a comedian. Miss Carolina, you fed me when my family had no food. You believed in my dreams when I was just a kid with nothing. I've been looking for you for 30 years because I needed to thank you properly. Steve, you don't need to thank me for anything. You were just a child who needed help. Miss Carolina, would you be willing to come to Chicago to be on my show? I have something very important I want to give you." 1 week later, Carolina Martinez sat in the green room of the Steve Harvey Show, wearing her best dress and clutching a small purse. Nervous about being on television, but excited to see the little boy she had helped so many years ago. When Steve walked into the green room to meet Carolina before the show, both of them immediately started crying. "Miss Carolina," Steve said, embracing the elderly woman, "you look exactly like I remember, just older and more beautiful. And you, Steve Harvey, you became everything I knew you would become." Carolina replied through tears, "I'm so proud of you." During the show, Carolina shared the story of how she had met young Steve and decided to feed him regularly when his family was struggling. Carolina, why did you choose to help a hungry little boy you didn't even know? Steve asked. Steve, you were just a child who needed food. I had access to food, and I could see that you were hungry. It wasn't a big decision. It was just the right thing to do. What did you see in that 9-year-old boy? I saw a sweet, smart child who had dreams bigger than his circumstances. You used to tell me you wanted to make people laugh, and even as a little boy, you had this way of making me smile even when I was having a hard day. Steve turned to address the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, this woman saved my life. When I was a hungry child with no hope, she fed me and believed in me. She told me I was going to be famous someday, and her belief gave me the strength to keep dreaming. Carolina, you never asked for anything in return. You just helped a child because you had a good heart. But now, 57 years later, I want to give you something. Carolina looked confused. Steve, you don't owe me anything. Seeing you successful and happy is all the thanks I need. Carolina, you invested in me when I was 9 years old. Now I want to make sure you never have to worry about money again. Steve handed Carolina an envelope. Carolina, this is a check for $1 million. Carolina stared at the envelope in shock, unable to process what Steve had just said. $1 million? She whispered. $1 million. You fed a hungry child for 6 months, and that child grew up to make millions of people laugh. This is my way of saying thank you for believing in a little boy's impossible dream. Carolina broke down crying as the audience erupted in applause and tears. Steve, this is too much. I can't accept this much money. Carolina, you can, and you will. You saved my life, and now I want to save yours from any financial worry you might have. But Steve wasn't finished. Carolina, I also want you to know that because of what you taught me about helping hungry children, I've established food programs that have provided millions of meals to kids who need them. Every child we've fed was fed because you fed me first. The most touching moment came when Carolina revealed something she had kept secret for 57 years. Steve, can I tell you something? Carolina said through her tears. Of course, Miss Carolina. Every meal I gave you came out of my own paycheck. I was making 85 cents an hour at Mickey's, and your meals cost about 75 cents each. But it was worth it because I could see that you were special. Steve was overwhelmed with emotion. You were just a teenager, and you spent your own money to feed me. You were hungry, Steve. When a child is hungry, you don't think about money. You just help. 6 months later, Carolina returned to the Steve Harvey Show for a follow-up that showed how her life had been transformed. Carolina, how has your life changed since we gave you that check? Steve asked. Steve, I'm living in a beautiful home that I own. I've been able to help my children and grandchildren, and for the first time in my life, I don't have to worry about money, Carolina said, looking healthier and happier than she had in years. What's the best part about not having to worry about finances? The best part is that now I can help other people the way I helped you. I've been volunteering at soup kitchens and helping families who are struggling with food, just like your family was struggling. Steve smiled. So you're still feeding hungry children? Of course. That's what I do, Steve. That's who I am. Today, Carolina Martinez is 74 years old and living comfortably in San Antonio. She has established the Steve's Burger Fund that provides meals to hungry children in her community, continuing the legacy of kindness that began with feeding a 9-year-old boy at Mickey's Burger Shack. Steve keeps a photo from their reunion on his desk. The moment when Carolina realized she was getting $1 million for her childhood kindness. But next to it is an even more precious photo, a recreation they took together of Steve eating a hamburger, while Carolina watches with the same loving smile she had 57 years earlier. Carolina taught me that kindness has no expiration date. Steve often says, she fed a hungry child in 1966, and that kindness is still feeding people today through all the programs we've created. That's the real $1 million lesson. kindness multiplies. Their story has inspired thousands of people to help hungry children and has led to the creation of food programs across the country, proving that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can grow into movements that change the world. If this incredible story of childhood kindness rewarded decades later moved you, please subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that no act of kindness is ever wasted. Have you ever helped a child who was in need? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more amazing stories about generosity, gratitude, and the miracles that happen when we choose to help instead of looking away.